Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. So this is episode 17, and today we were going to look over some resources that we had discovered, and then we'll briefly take a look at some of the results from clustering, which we talked about last time. I'm kind of going through some systematized clustering. So why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Yeah, so I ran across somebody that we had contacted. The name escapes me, but that's not important. Just put Smith.
This don't matter.
None of this matters. But there's a special issue of a journal called New Formations, which I wasn't fully aware of, and they did a special issue on automation and around issues of anxiety. So kind of getting it at kind of what we're exploring, thinking about the ways in which people respond to that. And so I've not made my way through that, but through that I found, and Jeremy's got it up, an older piece. Let me get the date on it, from 2014, on a term called heteromation, which has now become a book. And it's a term that these authors, Hamid Akbia and Bonnie Nardi, have come up to describe basically what we've been researching, which is these, and they sort of quickly trace that, automation becomes prevalent, and now heteromation are these tasks precisely that they need users, particularly end users, that are sort of indispensable to completing particular computational tasks. So, kind of that we talked about last time, the kind of last mile, which nicely reflects, the Uber and the Lime scooters that we think might be somehow related to this, right? That filling some gap in an otherwise automated system. And they come at it from a perspective of political economy, which is something that I'm not super familiar with, but seems to sort of link. There's interesting connections there in terms of what they look at. And one of the lines they have sort of late in this piece that Jeremy has up is that essentially something like, if you want to really understand what's going on in these contexts, that a sort of essentialist dichotomy between humans and non-humans doesn't really explain this division of labor. And this actually came at an interesting time, because in episode 16, and I think even back to episode 15, when Jeremy and I were discussing, what kinds of categories or things to look at when we go into the data that we've collected, right? That originally my instinct was that we would look at particular kinds of verbs or activities. And then I became sort of much more interested in the domains in which these tasks were being assigned, right? So it may not be that human beings are better at identifying, just identifying, but they're better at identifying in the context of commerce.
Yeah.
Telling about this piece is that they look at labor. That's their political economy, is their way into labor. And then what's further interesting is, so they do a bit on mechanical Turks, which I was excited about. That's the first example that they work through. But they link mechanical Turks to a bunch of other things they see as heteromation. So that includes citizen science, which is sort of crowd solutions to problems, where people either they play video games to help solve things, or they contribute data to an ongoing project. Then they also link it to video games, in particular the ways in which, right, that one of the lines from this early section of the video games piece is, imagine you're a video game company and receive tens of thousands of aggrieved email messages every day from your player base of 67 million players worldwide. So they look at sort of World of Warcraft and how it manages the online.
Or League of Legends, which has a notoriously toxic fan base.
So right in that second paragraph, they talk about game masters who sort of manage bad behavior, and essentially what they're doing is they're filling in some gap in the system that preferably, potentially, right, an algorithm will be able to flag certain language and know that harassment was happening or something like that. This is similar. Jeremy and I were just discussing in some earlier work we did looking at Wikipedia, the ways in which sort of different layers of editors work and talkback pages, that there's still people whose roles are designed to kind of keep the system functioning and running, And then the next example you'll see there at the bottom is Facebook and Google. So,
Right.
again, talking about the ways in which Google deals with complaints about content. So not just, and interesting that Facebook itself has these different roles, right? That they need humans at certain levels to moderate, but also the ways in which Facebook itself, its revenue model is predicated upon users looking at ads. So
Yeah.
that's right. The kind of the old critique of Facebook, I remember routinely happens, and I might find it and post it in our notes, right? That Facebook makes some big change. Some users of Facebook will complain about it. And then another segment will say, why are you complaining about this free service? And then somebody eventually posts the image of pigs complaining about the food at the slaughterhouse, right? With the idea that if the service is free, that means you're the product.
Right.
And they kind of explore that. But what I find interesting about the piece, just having just dove into this, is going back to what Casey Boyle was telling us, is that if we're trying to sort of identify the contours of a cultural technique, we need to think more broadly, right? Not just the technique, but the sort of the cultural technique. And so what I'm excited about this article is the way that it links Mechanical Turks with video games and citizen science and Facebook, Google. And so we're starting to see a kind of trajectory for the emergence of this this cultural technique that we think that we're potentially sort of engaging in trying to trace.
I'll add one that I just I posted it to the notes, but it was just well, we're keeping essentially a tabulation. Like, in fact, if we scroll down here in the notes, I think it's things like MTurk that may be aspects of a cultural technique. And so a lot of these are identified there.
Right.
And, we've talked about related things, Fiverr, Be My Eyes. Not sure why those are on the same line, but this one popped up for me as well. This is figure 8. They have a similar structure to Mechanical Turks in a way. As it says here, if you need labels and annotations for your machine learning project, we can help. You upload your unlabeled data with the rules you need for your machine learning project and launch. We use a distributed network of human annotators and cutting edge machine learning models to annotate that data at enterprise scale. So you give them data, say, here's what I want. And this communication is to a person so that they can kind of suss out, if you were in our shoes, for example, and we said, we have a coding scheme for all of those hits, all of those job posts. So I have 3 categories. I want to know what each one is, right? One way to do this is to use a service like this that would use a combination of machine learning and, a Turk itself, a section of human annotators, and it would give you that back, right? So here we see another kind of explicit blending, I guess, is being discussed here. I mean, if we want to use this terminology, right? Heteromation. This seems to be a pretty clear example of it, where it's talking about we're using machines working with, a pool of humans to spit out things on the other end.
Yeah. And I like that it sort of goes back into, I mean, you're going to start to sort of see the emergence of this is, right, we're kind of seeing it in the context of Fiverr and those kinds of things, but it's also interesting to see it as they sort of trace is just the problem of managing the internet.
Yeah.
Right. Just how do you
do it at scale?
Yeah. And so I think that's a kind of another interesting potential lineage here. Is not, I mean, normally you think about Mechanical Turks as it coming out of the inability of machines to do certain kinds of computational work, whatever, however you want to describe that. But it's also that one of its ancestors just might be, how do you organize not data, but people in online spaces?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a kind of interesting, branch of this, whatever we're looking at.
Yeah. And I don't think we want to muddy the waters, but I mean, certainly there are precedents that even go, as potentially Dr. Kang was gesturing toward,
Right.
reach further back than digital machines or even industrialization. I mean, a good example would be something like the invention of law, right?
Hmm.
In fact, code itself, and there's a book about code, I think it's called
Right.
Code, which is a fascinating thing, a fascinating bridge between, the machine and the non-machine, because legal codes, and that's where that metaphor is pulled from, right? Essentially articulate, here's what you can and can't do.
Right.
And it in part addressed similar problems of things like scale and heterogeneity, right? So a good example is things like, the Roman Empire started to solidify written law when they became an empire and started to expand. Well, at least it ramped up, started to
Hmm.
expand into other cultures, right? So the idea became, how do you manage people with very different notions of right and wrong, and that sort of thing? And you need something like written law to
Right.
manage scale, because it sets down, okay, here's what you can and can't do, here's what's legal and illegal. And that, even though you can have legality without law, it's individuated, right? Can we agree
Right.
this person acted rightly or wrongly? That doesn't scale. You can't have a personal adjudication for every person, and across cultures, right? Across
Right.
situations. So not to muddy things, but there are precedents for this
Yeah.
kind of issue of, how do we manage people at scale?
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
always,
Really
comes to these
interesting.
sort of non-human third parties sort of things.
Yeah. And then another piece, and I've not cracked this at all, but there's another piece in that new formations that's called Automation Now and Then. It's Automation Fevers, Anxieties, and Utopias. And it looks to be, skimming through it, it doesn't look like they reference Dr. Kang's work, but essentially it looks at automation from the 50s and 60s and today. So it looks as if it's a kind of a continuation of the trajectory that he's drawn.
Yeah. And now, as we move forward, we can kind of untangle how much of this is going to be prefatory material for what we're currently doing, and how much of it will be material that
Yeah.
is the bulk of, a later piece, right? Which is something we're
That,
still kind of negotiating.
well, that's kind of why I was sort of dipping in that the heteromate, my instinct potentially, and this depends on how we go, is if it turns out, and we'll turn to some of the data again here in a second, but thinking about if indeed we start to use like domains to understand some of this preliminary stuff, that heteromation piece might be useful as
Yeah.
prefatory, preface material in that first article that we imagine would be pretty computational rhetoric,
Hmm.
kind of work. Thinking in terms of how we've decided to organize our things, and based on some of these pieces, it might make sense to think of them in
Yeah.
those terms. So that it might be useful as a kind of potentially a justification for why we decided to parse what we're seeing the way we parsed it. Is there's some compelling stuff out there that finds that one of the interesting ways of figuring out the difference between human and non-human laborer is not necessarily some essentialist dichotomy, but actually thinking about the labor and you know capital kinds of things that are arranging this kind of work.
Yeah. Yeah, because in a way, that this first one, the meat of it, assumedly, is the data and the patterns in the data.
Yeah.
So in a way, the introductory or lit review material is setting up that, right? Setting up the pattern finding in the data. And some of these later works, it gradually transitions to the meat being the sort of theoretical questions of what this might mean or what its roots might be, right? Those kinds of things. So I think some
Yeah.
of these works, and it's kind of interesting to think about it in terms of like field or discipline,
Yeah.
because what do you see this as, like a political science or a?
I think so. I mean, I think they describe themselves as working from political economy, but they're kind
Yeah.
of also historians of technology
Uh-huh.
is also, I think, the larger umbrella. And so the introduction, they actually go through different ways in which historians of technology do their work. And so they pick through, they go through these ways, and then they sort of carve themselves out as, and then we're now using political economy to do history of technology.
Yeah. And they're pretty explicit, aren't they? There's, however, a fourth way of looking at this history that is from the perspective of political economy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think my sense of it will be, I'm betting the prefatory work comes from those sorts of perspectives and is, in a sense, kind of more, it's hard to discuss this without getting into kind of loaded concepts, but I suppose that's always the case. It is sort of more concrete in certain ways, less theoretical and abstract, more things like potentially that, or as we were looking at before, this auteur's
Yeah.
Poliani's paradox kind of thing that, is it kind of explicitly in its original formation, like, an economics piece,
Yeah.
sort of economics, labor stuff. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and the first Monday is just a journal that's just about, I think it was one of the first
Online one, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just about the internet. So I'm even looking right, their last special issue was just on the WhatsApp. So
yeah. And they've been around a long time.
yeah, 96.
Right. Yeah, it's one of the early ones, kind of, in our like sort of Kairos era in our field.
So anyway, so I thought
Okay.
that was a timely thing I saw, but I thought it nicely, it helped me think a little bit about what I'd speculated in terms of how we might think about what we've got. So
yeah.
And I think that heteromation is an interesting term, because that what can be meant by the hetero there is potentially pretty robust. I find it useful because it avoids the move, which I think I'm okay with, because right, even their subtitle, right, the invisible division of labor between humans and machines, but even that hetero suggests that hetero doesn't necessarily, it keeps that relationship really open in terms of thinking about how automation works. Like any number of it's less binary than
right, human and non, right, or human and machine. This is more different parts, right?
Different part, yeah. So
yeah, I mean, that's useful. I mean, if nothing else, it could give us a kind of terminology when we're talking about these shared production methods.
Yeah, and then calling it heteromation as they do then allows us to link mechanical Turks to things that we might not automatically associate it with.
Right. Yeah. Because we've talked about this in other ways that are more steeped in rhetoric. I mean, we even, you and I, in terms of, agonism and like when we were looking at the Andy Clark stuff. So different fields kind of wrestle with and articulate these entities, right? These multi-faced entities in different ways. Relatedly, there were a couple other things we added up here to these works that may be useful. This book that just was published, Rhetorical Machines.
Yeah, I think potentially I might shoot an email to those.
It's John Jones and Lavinia Hirsu.
Oh yeah, and that's interesting too, that Lavinia appears to be in applied linguistics.
Right.
So that's an interesting, So
yeah, it is always interesting to kind of see where those backgrounds are, because you can kind of maybe get a little bit of a sense of the angle the book's going to take.
Yeah.
Anywho, so those are some potential sources. Did you have other ones that you wanted to address? I want to skip over?
No, that special issue is one I've been making my way through. So
okay. Yeah, and with all of these, we'll eventually sort of have to draw the circle on, all right, these are the ones, because you can spin off into infinity in terms of what could
episode 17. It might be getting late in the game to be like, oh, here's another 4 books, and I mean we could just keep doing that. So but yeah, at some point we're gonna, as both with at every level of this project, we're gonna have to start drawing making some cuts.
As one of my mentors, Linda Woodson at Texas San Antonio, said, Jeremy, at some point you have to get out of the library.
Yeah.
Good advice. At some point you got to draw the circle.
Yeah.
This figure, I think.
Yeah, maybe the analysis of that is at some point you've got to start shutting, you got to start closing down browser tabs. It's
Yeah.
probably the new analogy.
Yep. So anyway, this figure eight thing, this was something just briefly that a couple of things that popped up, and this is on the note sheet. Although, the notes sheet itself is sort of a
Right.
monster.
Case in point.
Yeah. But this was so Google, unsurprisingly, they have this service to share data sets. I think it's called, and I'll vamp while you're out of frame here. Google, oh, that was easy. Data set, I think it's share or search, probably. It's Google, for goodness sake. Yeah, Google data set search. Another one of their programs where, they're, in this case, providing access to publicly available data sets. So it allows you to find data sets. I don't think they're hosting, as you can kind of see with an example here. I don't think they're hosting these, but they've essentially indexed things that are online. It's really kind of neat if you think about it in the sense that we have, as researchers, all these data sets that we make public, but the presumed reality of this is nobody looks at your data set,
Right.
once, even if it's something we're engaging right now, we have all this public data, but in a sense, it's kind of invisible unless there's other participation, right?
Right.
And so this starts to index all of those available data sets and then provides a search for them, which is really useful. And it sidesteps one of the tough problems of platform, right? That if everyone just, because we've seen these sorts of initiatives before where it's like, well, everybody share your data through this platform and everything will be great. But
Right.
then, as is a common problem in sort of computer science issues, what then happens is you get another competing platform that says, oh, but we're solving this problem that you're not, so let's all use this one. I mean, it's the old chestnut about you start out trying to identify what's the best, coding language for this. And in the end, you just make another one, right? So now
Right.
when you try and resolve the 16 competing standards, you end up with a 17th rather than an answer.
Right. It's just iteration.
Yep. It's kind of a cliche. This sort of sidesteps that by not doing platform. It's just like, well, let us index because we're Google. And then we just
Right.
point. I thought this was interesting because, I just searched kind of basically for Mechanical Turk. And it gives you mostly data sets that use Mechanical Turk. As you can see, this first hit, weather sentiment, Amazon Mechanical Turk data set. So, the data itself is sentiment about the weather. They used Mechanical Turk in order to get at those sentiments. And this one actually has.
Is this potentially when we were seeing, what was it, Hurricane Harvey that we were popping up for a little bit?
That'd be a good potential place to look. I
Yeah.
dug into those Hurricane Harvey ones a little bit. And a lot of those were surveys of people who had gone through Hurricane Harvey.
Yeah.
This one's a little bit different because, this is looking at tweets, and then the Turkers are coding those tweets, which is a little bit different than, hey, are you a Turker who also has been through a hurricane?
Right.
There's some interesting ones because, as we'll see here in a minute, in some categorizations that we did, it pairs those Hurricane Harvey surveys with cancer survivor surveys.
Huh.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, the patterns. And, if you actually look at the data, there aren't, those are very sort of, as you might anticipate, concentrated rather than distributed. It's not like Hurricane Harvey is a topic in the data set. It's a topic in a few hits.
Yeah. In those documents.
Yeah. And then the same is true. Like if you just search all the data for cancer, it's really only those cancer survey ones that get paired together. It's interesting, I think, from our perspective, that the clustering algorithms acknowledge that in particular ways. It's
Right.
not in all of them, but in some permutations, it's like, it seems like those go together, and as a person who's observing that post facto, it's like, yeah, those do seem like those go together,
Yeah.
Anywho, so this is mostly those kind of things, but not, and like this is code in R that allows you to provide and check bonuses. You got to get that bonus situation straightened
Sort it out.
RIP.
I
But some
know.
of them are about Turkers themselves.
Oh, so this is somewhat potentially related to our B set.
Yes, our second, yes, the B data pool, and then potentially also the second product, which we haven't really looked squarely at, but where we may be posting hits ourselves, both
Yeah.
to ascertain Turker perceptions in light of what we see in this first product, which is more computational, but then also potentially picking at the boundaries of why certain hits get traction and others don't. But so some of these, like I think this might be an example: replication data for the demographic and political composition of mechanical Turk samples. Or this might be Turkers of the world unite, multi-level in-group bias amongst crowd workers. So this is about Turkers, right?
Yeah.
So you see data sets that are sort of in a way expected, which are by Turkers, but then you'll also see, right, characteristics of mechanical Turk workers versus national 2014 BRFS, which I don't know what that is, but it's obviously in context, some demographic sample, right?
Right.
So this is sort of like the Imperiotis, and I hope I'm not butchering his name, who is doing research about Turkers, right? Who are the Turkers?
Right.
How many of them are there?
Who Turks?
Are they,
Who Turks the Turkers?
yeah.
Sorry, that interrupted your absolute flow for a bad joke.
But it's just looking at them. Are they concentrated in a particular geographical area? We have sort of assumptions about, because of the low compensation, it's like, well, are these third world
Yeah.
Turkers where what we see as sub minimum wage compensation, other parts of the world would see as typical compensation.
Yeah. And that gets, I remember going back to the Wikipedia, right? When certain people started, right, Wikipedia is open, everybody can edit it. And it turns out it's about 1,500 white guys,
Yeah.
right? Is this might not be that. In many ways, it might be a totally different demographic pool, but might be similarly homogenous.
Yeah, right. Open to everyone never really means, it's like any other democracy. It
Right.
never really means equivalent representation. And maybe it
Right.
shouldn't. You can make a case that it shouldn't mean that, but
Yeah.
it almost never pans out that way.
Yeah.
There are, even in places, with mandatory voting, there are still elites and not.
Yeah.
Anywho, so this was a useful thing. This is on the notes. I don't think it's going to be immediately useful necessarily. I was thinking maybe kind of the second product, in part because this is looking at Turkers and it gives you these sort of big data sets about Turkers, who they are, anywho. And then this one just popped up. We spend too much time on this, but again, when we turn to, and this, as you say, may relate to that B pool, which we really haven't done anything with. And I'm starting to wonder if it's going to manifest in the first product at all, or if it's something that may bleed its way into the second product. Sorry. Did you have something there?
Oh no, just that it may just be that we put that off, because I think one of the things we discussed too is we may need to use this first piece just to get ourselves into a position where we can ask meaningful questions of Turkers. So
in theory, it gives you a kind of baseline, even though the point of it isn't to answer a question like who are Turkers. It is more exploratory in terms of how can we pull patterns out of this data. Still,
right.
I think that'll give us at least a notion of the lay of the land. We've used metaphors precisely like that, right? Using sonar to try and understand the topography of this thing. This was interesting, and this is a popular, this is just on Gizmodo, but it is useful because it's sort of these, you can see what its positioning is from the title,
right.
but it has, sort of interview, very small and kind of qualitative.
Yeah, that first quote right there. It also just relatedly, but potentially not. at least where our project getting some traction, because I had 6 separate people email me this.
This.
Email me this link. Yeah, I know I've been watching your project on Mechanical Turks. Thought this might be interesting. So
yeah, I like that when people are like, they know your thing, so they're like, "You're the Turk guy, right?"
So it's heat's heat.
Yep. Well, and also, and this may or may not manifest, but the Harvey and the cancer surveys, and what we talked about with Amy Evans from IRB, the notion of risk and trauma.
Yeah.
It might be interesting to see how this plays out, because a lot of this story, as this pull quote articulates, has to do with things like, MTurk job posts that are sort of survey based and oftentimes tapping into trauma, as the cancer survivor one kind of does as well.
Yeah.
And the sort of strange compensation where it's, as this quotation points out, it's like, 50 cents to recall the most painful memory of my life. It fucked me up for the entire day.
Yeah.
So asking about, are you a survivor of this? And it's like, I'm not sure if 50 cents is. And this also has some really interesting things about the mechanics of it. Like, once you accept, and this does kind of manifest in the data we have, potentially in the B pool, once you accept a hit, not just looking through the postings of hits, there's no real tracking in terms of, passing them by. But once you accept a hit, there is a sort of reciprocity if you then don't do it, right? So if you see a hit post that says, 5-minute survey result, or take a 5-minute survey, that's all you're getting for the description. And you click, okay, I'm going to do that. And then the first question is, were you abused as a child?
Right.
And that's a realistic scenario where it's not like it's going to necessarily say in the description, caution, this may be asking personal questions about trauma survivors, right?
Right. There aren't trigger warnings in these hits.
Not in the data we have. I mean, not consistently. Some of them do say things like adult subject matter, but that tends to deal with, sexual things. But usually, even in that case, it's like, advertisements for sexual products. I mean,
right.
Sexual aids. I'm fumbling for a generic term, but objects that you would purchase.
Marital aids is a standard.
I mean, that came to mind, but I'm like, I'm not really going to say marital aids.
Well, I did.
But that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
So usually that tends to deal with that, but this is kind of an interesting. I don't know if it's going to be immediately useful, but it does kind of broach that B pool of. Yeah.
And what I noticed too is that Gizmodo used Mechanical Turks to do it.
Yeah, as we will potentially be doing.
Which is itself kind of interesting. I'm right. Stop right there. So it's right. So you've got this pull quote. Someone paid me 50 cents to recall the most painful memory, and then Gizmodo.
Now you're asking me to rehash it.
Ask workers specifically for their strangest and worst experience on the platform. Right. I mean, there's a.
Or potentially less. Now it's a quarter.
Yeah. For a quarter, tell me about how much it fucked you up when you had to recall your most painful memory for 50 cents.
Yeah, very much sort of the experimenter changing the experiment, right?
Yeah.
Anywho, so, and it's interesting because, I mean, maybe we should contact Gizmodo and say, did you guys go through IRB for this? Which I'm guessing the answer is absolutely not.
No.
Never even rose to our idea to do that, because I mean they're journalists, they function under different protections. But it is interesting, given our conversation with Amy Evans about IRB is steeped in the notion of a human as a risk vessel, a vessel capable of harm and trauma.
No, and what's interesting about this too is that IRB, I mean, particularly if you trace a lineage of code, right? Actually, IRB becomes not just something we have to go through, but IRB may be part and parcel of this cultural technique that we're.
Yeah.
That IRB might be a kind of heteromation.
Yeah, and it is protocols, and it's protocols. I mean, if you know the history of IRB, that in part kind of grew up in the wake of, the Milgram experiments. Yeah, and I mean, it grew up in the wake of, Nazi trials. After World War II, and we started to kind of grapple with notions of test, human subjects, as it is literally called, and all those permutations, both, things like medical experiments, and we're still dealing with the lineage of knowledge born of potentially monstrous medical experiments.
Oh, what's the
the anatomy texts,
yeah, well, and then the Henrietta, oh, what's the African American woman who's,
Oh, Henrietta Lacks, yeah.
yeah, her
The
cells
HeLa
become
cells, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that got some traction a while back. The idea of, in that case, you're taking somebody's cells. That's an interesting case because, trying to communicate that to her family, we don't have her alive and experimenting on her, but, this lineage of cells is indeed a biological portion of, and that's a tough thing to communicate to people. It's like, well, she's not alive exactly, but parts of her are.
Have you seen the film Annihilation?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that the Natalie Portman character, who's the biologist, is in one of the scenes in bed. She's reading a biography of
The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Anywho,
that legacy of the ways that certain cell cultures persist and become a part of that shape the science that's being done is pretty
and the continual renegotiation of those things into the greater social plexus, right? I mean, it's not like we're ever going to, IRB doesn't then dust its hands and say, well, we've got our protections set. It's a constant rearticulation of, well, now who and what is protected, right? So
right.
You see, you go through hiring practices and it's like, well, what's a protected class now? And what does that mean, right? I mean, ageism, for example, which, as my wife told me, isn't possible if you're under 40. Do you know that?
Yeah. It's not?
Yeah, you can't file an ageist complaint if you are under 40, I believe she said.
Isn't that ageism?
Yes, and it's it's not arbitrary, but it's subjective, right?
Oh man.
Here's the line of what count. If you're 39 or you're 41 when this happens, there's a big world of difference.
Yeah.
Anywho,
okay. Okay, boomer.
So there's this. The other thing I wanted to look at today was just some stuff that was popping out of the data. Let me first stop sharing here. Let me pull this up and share clustering results. So, okay, so just kind of briefly, as we talked about last time, I've been going through just a lot of runs of the data, and I'm not finished, but I have been noticing some things already. And the good news is, I think now I have a more manageable understanding of what steps to go through, because in the beginning here, I was doing a lot. I still was, drawing a circle and all right, well, I just need to figure out what I'm going to do, because, this is the K of 5, right? The small category number. This is before we start making K larger, and then either having you or I or other people, or or permutations of that, looking at what comes out on the other end. So this is the K of 5, and I was doing a lot of you can kind of see with the tabs down here, and I haven't shared all this yet because I haven't wrangled it into a coherent format, but using just some different means to categorize. And I think this is one that we looked at actually during last episode, because I was using Clustex, which is a package that allows you to change K really quickly. Whereas some of the other methods to do this, you have to run the whole thing again after you change K. You don't have to do that with Clustex, but there's trade-offs involved there. Mm-hmm. But you can kind of see in this one, if you look at this, right, ad hoc, match.
Still interested in that.
Yeah, and so that tends to come out, and as we kind of look at these, that manifests. The question is always kind of, does it split off, as we see in this scenario, into its own thing, where one of the categories is that type of post, which is the sort of strange bot-like hits, or is it attached to a different category with other terms? But anywho, so you can see the good news is, I think, in running a lot of these, there is a certain similarity. It's not radically different between different clustering methods so far, which I think is useful, because then it's not so much a question of which one is the blessed one of them, right?
Right.
But this is an example, running one form of clus text, and you can see it's got the this bot kind of language with survey. Here it's got receipt, shop, extract. That's probably pretty coherent there. You're probably extracting information off shopping receipts.
Yeah.
Upload, record, website, right? Compensation and hit. And then Hurricane Harvey gets its own kind of breakout here. This is a deeper look at those same results. So this is not a new clustering. You can in fact see how these numbers over here, these are the numbers of hits in each of these clusters. So you can see these numbers are the same because they're the same.
Okay.
They're clustered the same. This is just a deeper look at those clusters themselves.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
It's the other related.
Yep. So for example, this first one, ad hoc, whatever, and survey, if you look a little bit deeper at that, you can see all these other terms that are also prevalent in there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Survey, ad hoc, but then also, question, answer, task, maybe that's survey stuff, complete, the letter U, study, hit, minute, not anything that's like out of left field compared, it's like survey. A lot of these other things seem to be survey terms, right?
Yeah.
Receipt, shop, extract, but then also things like image, readable, and readability.
Because it looked like when I was going through it too, that those receipts, they were actually having people look at, it appeared to be potentially images of receipts.
Yeah, because that word extract suggests, you're looking at images of them, because otherwise, if they were text data, you wouldn't need a person to do that, right? Assumedly, what you're doing here is looking at a range of receipt images and pulling the data out of them, potentially training a machine learning algorithm to do that, right?
Right.
So that's there. And this is in part kind of interesting, because if you start looking at these in comparison to other clustering methods, these terms aren't always together. So, in some permutations, image won't be with this extract, receipt information. But we'll take a look at that. Here we have record, upload, website, but then also things like voice, talk, and we'll see in other versions, it'll split those off. So are you like uploading a recording to a website, or are you transcribing speech, right?
Right.
And so, as is always the case with any kind of categorizing, you have to look, okay, out of these 291, the good news is it gives us for each one of them, it says it is this cluster, right? So we can take a look at those and poke through them and say, okay, well, what is going on there? Is it transcription? Is it screen capture, right? Anywho, and so that's kind of Hurricane Harvey. You can kind of see, it tells you a little bit about what they're asking there. Study impact. This is because it's a follow-up. What's that?
Yeah, no, that impact kind of makes that
tells you what it's asking about.
Right.
And then I opted to retain numbers. You can eliminate numbers when you clean your data, but I thought there may be some utility in numbers, and sometimes things pop up like second here, because this is the second follow-up.
Okay.
So occasionally numbers give you something.
We'd have to do, but they'd probably need a bit more, potentially more digging than some of those other ones might.
Some of them need context. Sometimes you'll get things like dates, which can sometimes be useful. But anywho, so these are just some different methods, and then some notes to myself about how they were made here. Now, again, we're always dealing with the same data, but you can just see if you use, so clustex uses its hierarchical clustering. SK-means is a spherical k-means. And then here it tells me the method I used, in this case, genetic. And as we talked about last time, there's just so many ways to iterate these. The good news is I think now I've kind of figured out here are the ones I'm going to use. And one of the things that helped me do that is a lot of these, when you make those tweaks, the results aren't so different that it's like, I don't think I need to do every permutation. It's like this one is quick and effective. I'm just going to do this one and not worry about all the potentially infinite permutations it could be. Here, you know, and keep in mind also when we get clusters, those categories, it's not like you can compare categories across, because when they cluster them together, it's not like it's saying, oh, well, here's the extract receipts one. You know what I mean? Because it may have complete, I'm telling it, give me 5, but the breaks of what those 5 are could be anything. Right. So it's not like you're going to have a receipt extract data cluster across methods here. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because it's one of them may not find that at all and say,
yeah, well, didn't we even notice that if you made, so if we make the K10, yeah, it might be that the word extract shows up nested within a whole bunch of other, yeah, not in this, right? It's not going to be in the same row as we're seeing it here, right? So it might be image and shop stay together, image or receipt and shop stay together, but image and extract show up in another cluster entirely.
Yeah, and like here's a case, right? So ad hoc is no longer in this one, its own thing. And in fact, it shows up in this weird category with book, movie ticket. Yeah. It's like, well, are you pricing movie ticket? I mean, it's like, right. So the categories are not the same, and it's just they find different things and they give them different numbers. It's, you know, you gotta view these as completely unrelated to each other. And all you're saying to the machine is take all this data and sort it into 5 lumps. And there is no guarantee that they're going to see anything close to the same kind of lumps. The kind of good news is, despite that, there is enough overlap that it's not like, well, this one's talking about horses. And it's like, and this one isn't. I mean, it's not like it's so radically different. Even this one where it's like, well, I didn't see books and movies pop up at all last time. And yet a lot of this is pretty darn similar, right? Image, receipt, extract. It's like, oh, okay, yeah. This one talking about hit compensation. We see here again, record and website, right? And it's like, oh, okay, that may be close to that other one. Short survey, quick summary, audio, right? And then again, we got Hurricane Harvey over here. So you see some of the same stuff. Yeah. And it's why. But that is, I mean, that's, I mean, there's, I mean, that's, you know, just repeating it for myself more than anything, but right, that notion that the number of clusters we pick could have a particularly big impact on how it is we end up understanding this thing. Yeah, and it's also why, as we talked about last time, so this is telling the machine, give me 5 clusters, and then what are the prevalent terms in those clusters? Now, if we ramp this up to let's see, like 50. Yeah. You start to see those things in a lot more fine-grained way, right? Survey, question, answer. That's so interesting. Well, item, rule, batch, tell, extract, shop, receipt. Or let's look at 20. And you can notice if you use one of the clustex methods, it doesn't, I asked for 10 prevalent terms. It doesn't always give you, it doesn't give you that. But you can see, like with a K of 20, it starts to parse out things individually. So Hurricane Harvey is together, but then, you know, summarize is its own thing. Audio is its own thing. Alcohol is its own thing. So that's why last time we talked about there's going to be utility in not just telling the machine, give us 5 categories, but telling it, give us a lot of categories and let us or other people on the back end compile these down, right? In looking at these 20, can we turn that into fewer, let's say,
Right.
5 or 10 or 8? But, I started with the small k because I want to see how much labor this is going to entail.
Yep.
And I've got an answer for that more or less, because I still think there, even when we're doing like these different ones with the k of 5, the goal here isn't to pick, oh, okay, sk means is the right way to go because it gives us
Right.
one. What we want to do is have sort of a range of a few of these. And so basically what I'm going to be doing is basically 5 methods where we'll have hierarchical clustering, k-means clustering, spherical k-means clustering, and then probably 2 topic modeling techniques, LDA topic models and STM topic models. I'm really looking forward to the STM topic models because they give you the FREX, which we've looked at before, terms that are frequent in a category, and then ones that are exclusive to it. They give you this different measurement.
Oh, so these are like we only found here.
They're not truly exclusive, but they're more prevalent in a, it's like this category really talks about audio, and audio barely shows up in the others. They're not truly exclusive, but it's just like the proportion is so much more here. So it's in a way, it's kind of similar to like TF-IDF, not in terms of what it's doing, but the idea is we're surfacing this notion of things that are important in ways that aren't just frequency. They're kind of important in proportional ways, right? It's not just this appears a lot, it's that it really only or largely appears here.
Yeah.
So that's a really neat tool, because frequency is one thing, but exclusivity is another thing,
Well, and that might be useful, particularly if we're thinking about, we want to see what term, like if we're thinking about the kind of domain structure.
If you want differentiation, right? I mean, that can be, I think, a really useful thing. But anyway, and then within those, I'm not going to do multiple algorithmic, because I mean, there's different methods have lots of within them different algorithms. Now that choice is significant. I mean, like if you do hierarchical clustering and if you do, complete versus Ward, and there are two versions of Ward, what you see is very different. But that said, there is guidance about which one of those to pick and why. And also, like if you do complete for hours, what you see is not useful, because what it ends up doing is lumping basically 99% of all hits into one category. I mean, literally what happens is 4 of those categories are 1 hit each, and then the other 23 whatever thousand are the rest. So it's like, well, that is completely useless, because you're trying to suss out what that big category is, and it's basically the data set. Whereas if you use a Ward method, it gives you kind of balanced categories. And that's one other thing, is like how balanced numerically are these categories, which isn't necessarily a goal, because maybe those hits aren't balanced, right? I mean, you may have a lot more of one than another, but balance is meaningful in the way that, if a category has one thing in it, it probably shouldn't be a category, or anywho.
Yeah, although I could see ourselves to a point where there's only one thing in it, but it might be that one thing could be potentially interesting.
Well, or
but there's nowhere to go with it. I mean, that's 5 that's interesting.
So this is an illustration of precisely what we're talking about here, right? Look at the number breakdown of clusters here, right? One. And this is kind of useful because it's like, oh, okay, we're just getting these, characters that are.
3/4. That's interesting.
Yeah. Here, there's only 5 examples. Clip, describe, build, sandcastle.
Word, boy, beat, video.
It's like, that's interesting, but it's very individuated, right? I mean,
that could almost be like there's 5 ones that are just like
they're talking about this.
Describe this boy building a sandcastle on the beach.
Yes, that's what it is.
Yeah.
Anywho.
Yes.
What's that?
I'm a genius.
And then within this, so not only and see, this is why this can easily become a life's work, just what we're doing here, is because this is just looking at stemmed unigrams and then looking at their frequency. You can
Right.
also run these same permutations if you first weight the data set using something like TF-IDF and then run it. So you can see the difference in SK means here versus SK means same stuff exactly. Only difference is weighted TDF-IDF and it's different, right? It's similar, but it's different. Then we're just talking about unigrams. What happens if you do this with bigrams and trigrams, which presents problems just computationally because the machine starts to choke on that much data.
Yeah,
But
you've had those experiences already where it just
yeah,
won't do it.
yeah, although largely I was able to resolve those issues. I think for this, we are going to run into scale problems where it just won't be, this machine won't be able to do that. So the only solution is either get a beefier, get access to a beefier machine, which, I think, do I need to ask on campus, like, does anyone have server
Right.
space that, or the
Yes.
other thing is you have to clean it in particular ways where you're doing things like eliminating by rank. So, half the unigrams may only occur one time. So if you cut those out and then run the remaining half, it may be able to do it. The question is, to what degree is that mucking with your results? Because it could be it's not really hurting it because those things were never going to show up regardless, but it helps the machine computationally because it doesn't have to worry about that whole other half of the data.
Right.
However, it does change things. It's not the case that if you eliminate low frequency things, your data is identical. It
Right.
may not manifest, and unfortunately, in a sense, it's kind of impossible to see what the difference is, because the way to do that would be to run it whole and then run it with low frequency stuff removed. But you can't run it whole. That's the problem. Otherwise we would,
Right.
so it's impossible to compare the two without solving the problem that's put you in this situation. So you're always a little bit sort of unclear about how much these results have been changed by filtering things out by frequency, or if you're doing TF-IDF rank, right, weight.
Right. And because you can't know, because if you ran it another way, it's like your thing about just to figure out which of the 16 you want, you get 17.
Yeah,
Like
I mean, potentially. Yeah, well, it's the case where it's like, if you could run it to see what the difference between running the data whole and running it cleaned is, you wouldn't be in this fix. You just run it
right.
whole. You're doing this because you're unable to do that. Anywho, that's maybe a problem for another day. But the kind of good news is I know what we're going to do, and it won't be a huge computational problem. I'm going to run into some issues when I start doing bigrams and trigrams, but when we step K up, that won't be a big problem.
Okay.
It'll be a problem, but it won't be a big problem. And I know kind of the steps, as I said, we're basically going to be doing 5 things and just really one method per thing. And that'll give us a good scatter because we'll be doing it just sort of stock. Then we'll do it TF-IDF. And then we'll do that same pattern for unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, which also will reflect what we did with the frequency measures. So there's a kind of tidiness in terms of what we're doing there. So
and what was the tidiness is just we're able to what makes it tidy, I guess.
What makes it tidy is we're kind of looking, so in the frequency measures, basically what we looked at was unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, regular, and then TF-IDF weighted. That's basically what we're doing here, is looking at unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, regular TDF-IDF weighted, and then clustering or categorizing them through different means. But we're looking at the same stuff in the same ways. It's not like we use TDF-IDF and now we're doing a radically different weighting schema. We're doing kind of the same stuff. that's what makes it tidy.
Okay.
So anywho, the next step really is just me finishing this. And then what we'll have is, for this small K size, a scatter of, what would that be? If we're doing 5, 10, 3 different ways, 30. We'll have 5 different methods for standard, 5 different standards, for standard unigrams, 5 different methods for TDF, IDF, weighted unigrams, and then we'll do that same thing for bigrams and trigrams, which will end up with 30 of these worksheets that give us results, basically. So that's what I'll do next, and then we'll go from there in terms of having a large K and having us or people look at it. Now, when we get to that point, I don't think we'll be able to have a huge swath of 30 sheets, because I don't think you'll be able to ask people, look at 30 worksheets and categorize each one of them into smaller units. I just don't think people will do it.
Yeah.
I think in that scenario, we may have to do things like pick one, or pick a few from that pool and say, here, take these. Let me just show you an example, so this is not abstract. Take these 20 clusters, which each have, in this scenario, they would have 5 or 10 frequent terms. Take those and boil that down to 5 or whatever categories, based on what you see here. Which of these should go together if you need to get to 10 categories or whatever.
Almost seeing in terms of collapsing these 20 down into. Okay.
Yeah, you could see it as heteromation, right? The machine is doing the first pass, giving us this large K size. We're doing then the second pass, taking these 20 categories and folding them into 5 or whatever.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting. This is just maybe a question that doesn't matter, but I'm noticing that it's the numbering of the clusters.
Yeah.
Like, why? I'm just wondering, but they don't correspond to, like, so this is ranked according to the number.
Right. I know what you mean. This is size, the number of hits in each one. Why isn't this 1, 2? Why aren't they being cluster 1, 2 by rank? And that really depends on the method you're using. So this is using hierarchical clustering. Let me pull this up really quick, and we're running short on time here. So so this is a dendrogram. You can see this, right?
Yeah.
So in this method, when it's making clusters, the way it's doing that is it looks at one and then it compares it. It breaks it to see if it's similar or different from the other stuff it's around, and it kind of runs through that process. And so it's like you have one, and then you've got the rest of the data pool, and then it sort of goes through this tree process. That's why it's hierarchical clustering. So you get those differences because it's not always the case that, if you look at this structure, it's not always the case that you'll have, well, this is going to be the biggest, and then the next one will be the second biggest. It really depends on how these things break, right? I mean, these are the two big categories here, but it's like this category isn't necessarily going to be the biggest one. It's just the first one where it breaks in terms of similarity. So you see that difference. It's not like category 2 is the second biggest. Using this method, it's just, but these are the ones that are the same regardless of size.
Okay.
So I don't have a great answer for that, but I've got sort of a fuzzy answer about, like, if you look at this, there's no reason why it would, be big, smaller, smaller, right? You know what I mean?
No, I just wanted to make sure that I asked a good question. That's really all. I wanted validation.
Well, and I spent some of the time running like a dendrogram here, and then I did some elbow plots. Let me see.
And those elbow plots, as you described it to me, those are where you can start. That helps you to kind of know where to start.
Yeah. So, in fact, let's just. So this, I couldn't really run elbow plots for the full data set because again, it would choke. So I was doing random samples of 10,000 hits, random independent samples, and doing elbow plots. They're k-means elbow plots. And yes, what it shows you is what's a likely good choice for what k should be. And it's 5. I mean, that's why we came to the k of 5 essentially, is if you look at these random samples within the data, see how they're slightly different, but the bend, the elbow, is consistently at 5. See where it starts to flatten out here, here. Hold on, I gotta hide this. Here, here. It's consistently, even though these are all different.
Right.
It's consistently at 5. And then if you look at the dendrogram, it's not crazy to break this into 5 categories. So when we say, why are you doing K5? It's because we have reasons, right? It's not just arbitrary.
That's what I was thinking. That's what I was trying to say, that the elbow lets you know where a sweet spot might be for K.
Yep, precisely. Yeah, and there are other methods to determine that, but selection of K is always a little bit, it's always a little bit of alchemy.
Sure.
Where it sort of gives you a range of this is probably good. But I mean, you can see in each one of these, the weird sort of long tail where it's like, what was going on here? You know, I mean, something interesting potentially is down there.
Right.
But it's a question of diminishing returns.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it gives us evidence for, you know, why are you doing K5? Because the elbow plots and the dendrogram suggest that's at least a reasonable unit of K. All right, well, we're out of time. So what we can do is I'm going to be finishing this now that I've got it. You know, unfortunately, as is the case always, the semester's started to kick into, you know, normal practice. So it's what I want to be doing is this, but what I am doing is semester stuff. But I need to finish running those cluster things now that I know precisely sort of the schema I want to go through.
And then a quick update on my end. I actually have a grad student in rhetoric who's taking through American Studies a digital humanities class.
Okay.
So she was actually was brainstorming possible projects they have to work on, and so she read up on our project and then discussed with her professor in that class. So I might reach out to that person too as potentially someone to talk to and to see if, you know, what interest there might be in terms of, so just something on the horizon, but I might reach out to that person and just maybe meet them and see what comes of it. So
well, and even things like, you know, when we run this with the sort of larger K, and our goal is to boil that down to fewer categories. We talked about, is that something you and I would do, or should we have other people do it to get sort of an exterior perspective? And I would, you know, potentially a class could do this. It wouldn't even take, I mean, if you gave them a list of this and you were like, hey, boil this down to 5 categories. I don't care how you do it. I just want 5. And then we saw what they did, or if we compared that to, you know, do it in groups, let's say, and then see how different groups did that. I mean, that's a potential, you know, a potential thing we can do a little bit later. So yeah, if you have those kind of things, because I was going to do it with a grad class as well, if it's something we opt to do. I sort of, before we did that, I just wanted to check with Amy and make sure we wouldn't need IRB, because it's like, they aren't our subjects.
No.
You know, but they are, I mean, what they really are is co-authors, you know, small co-authors.
Yeah.
Because they're
no, I think that's probably true. Although to a certain extent, we are interested in what they make of this. So in that sense, they are subjects.
So I was going to check just to make sure, hey, if we did this, would we have to get approval? And if so, it's like, do we want to go through a approval, or do we just want to do it ourselves and sidestep that quagmire? I mean, I don't know. Anyway. All right, so that's where things are headed. I'm going to stop sharing. That's where things are headed now. Anything else?
No, that's all I got.
Okay.
This is a meaty.
What's that?
This is a meaty episode.
It is, and I mean, we are moving forward. We just need to make sure that we do. I mean, we just kind of iteratively move forward. Realistically, I mean, I was wondering if this was something we could finish in the spring. I don't think so. I think probably the summer is a more realistic goal, just because once the semester ramps up, progress always kind of slows. So.
Oh yeah, no. In terms of logistical stuff, I just had my annual review meeting, and I indicated in my thing that this year would probably at some point see at least one publication, but I thought that we'd be well into the spring before we probably got to a point where we could make sense of it.
Yeah. So. We'll shoot for spring, but I suspect summer.
Yeah.
All right then. Well, we're out of time, so I will see you later. Oh, I recognize Underworld on your shelf there.
Yeah.
DeLillo. It's a good book.
I've not read it yet. I got it as a gift.
It's good. It's good. I mean, it's long, but it's interesting.
Yeah,
it's applicable.
It's daunting, but I'll get into it.
But it's about waste in interesting way, waste and memory. So I'm familiar with it.
That's your memory thing.
Yeah, and waste.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you later.
On that note, bye.
Yep.